The winds over Lake Melloren still whisper ancient truths. Beneath the quiet soil of Burka, a once thriving Viking outpost, lies a grave so powerful, so intricately staged, that for over a century it shaped how we imagined Viking warfare. It told a story of dominance, strategy, and prestige. A story believed to belong to a man. Grave BJ 581 was no ordinary burial. Positioned high on a ridge overlooking the garrison, it commanded visibility and honor. This was a spot reserved for warriors of rare caliber, leaders, tacticians, the ones who returned from battle not just alive, but victorious. Within the grave, archaeologists found a full arsenal: a sword finely wrought, a deadly axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, a battle knife, 2 shields, not one, but 2 horses, a mare and a stallion, sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife. And then, tucked among the weapons, a set of gaming pieces. Quiet, unassuming, yet perhaps the most potent artifact of all. Because in the Viking world, these weren't mere diversions. They were symbols of command, intellect, and tactical genius. Only those who planned raids, anticipated moves, read the battlefield like a living puzzle. Only they were buried with such tools. The message was clear. This wasn't just a fighter. This was a leader of fighters. And so the identity of the buried figure seemed obvious. A man, naturally. How could it be otherwise? In the 19th century worldview of the archaeologists who uncovered the grave, a warrior was male by default. This idea calcified over generations. The textbooks agreed. The grave was cited again and again as a model, even an icon, of elite Viking masculinity, until the bones began to speak. They spoke softly at first. Anna Kellström, a Swedish osteologist, noticed something subtle in the skeletal structure. The pelvis was wider than expected, the long bones more gracile, the skull missing the angular features common in males. Her findings didn't sit well with the academic consensus. Many dismissed them, suggesting the bones must have been miscategorized, or perhaps were female, but only coincidentally associated with the warrior's gear. A fluke, an outlier, anything but a female warrior. But the past, when questioned precisely, sometimes fights back. A team led by Charlotte Hedinstierna Johnson at Stockholm University took samples from the body, a tooth and part of an arm bone. What they were looking for wasn't buried in the earth, but written into the ancient script of DNA. And the DNA did not hesitate. 2 X chromosomes. No Y. The warrior of BJ 581, entombed with the full regalia of a military commander, was biologically female. This wasn't speculation. It was definitive. The DNA sequence left no room for doubt. And with that single test, 130 years of certainty cracked open. The assumptions, the biases, the cultural overlays, all exposed. The weapons weren't symbolic heirlooms. The horses weren't just ceremony. This wasn't a burial for someone pretending to be a warrior. This was a warrior. And yet the real story was only beginning. Because who was she? What did her presence in Burka, in that grave, mean? Was she a commander who rose through merit, through bloodline, through extraordinary circumstance? Or did she belong to a wider, hidden world of Viking women whose stories have simply failed to survive? The grave was never a lie. We were simply asking the wrong questions. It began, not with a sword, but with a sliver of enamel, a tooth buried in darkness for over 1,000 years. No saga ever mentioned her name. No chronicle sang her praises. Yet within that tooth, locked in ancient molecules, waited a truth sharp enough to cut through centuries of certainty. She was buried as only the elite were, but the story etched into her bones was only half of what she carried. The rest, the undeniable, revolutionary truth, would emerge in a modern lab, where history no longer relied solely on artifacts and assumptions, but on code. When Anna Kellström first raised the possibility that the skeleton in Burka's BJ 581 grave was female, it triggered little more than academic discomfort. Her analysis was meticulous. The pelvis, jaw, long bones, all pointed away from a male frame. But the idea that a Viking warrior could be a woman was too disruptive, too contradictory. So it was dismissed as a mistake, a misidentification, or an irrelevance. But then came the DNA. Charlotte Hedinstierna Johnson and her team retrieved samples from the warrior's left humerus and a canine tooth. They didn't look for opinions. They searched for chromosomes. What they found silenced a century of presumption. No Y chromosome. 2XS. The warrior had been a woman all along. And yet this wasn't just about biological sex. It was about the ripple that confirmation sent through archaeology, anthropology, and Viking studies worldwide. Grave BJ581 wasn't merely an anomaly. It was a fracture in the very foundation of how we define power, gender, and identity in the ancient world. Historians had long argued that women in Viking culture were powerful, as matriarchs, landowners, seers. But battlefield leaders? That was reserved for men. Even the rare mentions of shield maidens in Norse literature were usually filed under mythology, decorative fantasy, saga-born illusions. Until now. Because this was not myth. This was measurable. The burial wasn't ambiguous. The weapons were real. The horses were real. The DNA, irrefutable. This was a professional warrior, afforded the same ritual honors as the most respected male fighters of her time. Her sex had been invisible to the eye, but not to science. And the question that rose from her bones was larger than any single person. What else have we misunderstood, simply because we didn't want to see it? Her mitochondrial DNA confirmed something equally vital. All the remains in the grave belonged to one individual. There was no male warrior lost to time, no mix-up, no shared burial. Every object, every weapon, every symbolic piece of her story was hers alone. Suddenly, centuries of scholarly caution looked more like collective avoidance. But even this wasn't the end of what her DNA revealed. She carried more than just identity. She carried legacy. Her genetic profile connected her to people across the Viking world. The British Isles, the Orkney Islands, Iceland, Denmark, and the Eastern Baltics. A woman of war, yes, but also a woman of the sea, of trade routes and longships, of shifting frontiers and tangled lineages. She was not a local outlier. She was a mirror to her time. And as more ancient genomes are uncovered and compared, her uniqueness begins to blur. Not because her story is less significant, but because it's part of a broader truth we've only begun to admit, that the Viking world was never as rigid, as patriarchal, or as simple as we imagined. Science has given her back to us, not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as a challenge. She asks us to look harder, to question louder, to remember that truth doesn't disappear. It waits, silent, buried, encoded, until we're ready to listen. In the quiet stillness of that grave, a forgotten mind lay buried, not just a fighter, but a thinker. Someone who didn't just swing a blade, but moved others across a battlefield like pieces on a living board. Long before the modern world drew maps or wrote manuals on leadership, she understood it. And the Vikings knew she did, because they buried her with proof. Among the swords, spears, and shields, there was something far more telling. A full set of gaming pieces. Small, carved tokens. A board. Objects easy to overlook. Yet in Viking culture, they meant one thing: command. This was not a grave of brute strength alone. It belonged to someone who planned raids, who directed men, who anticipated enemy moves before swords ever clashed. In a world where strategy determined survival, she was not the weapon. She was the one who wielded them all. Viking games like Nefatiful weren't idle pastimes. They were simulations of war, asymmetric challenges, where one side defended, the other attacked. Success demanded foresight, patience, and ruthless precision. The inclusion of a full set wasn't symbolic decoration. It was a signature. This individual led. And yet, for over a century, the presence of those pieces was never connected to her gender. They were attributed to a presumed male, because to imagine a woman orchestrating battlefield tactics was unthinkable. The idea didn't fit into the frame that history had built. But now that the truth of her sex is known, those same artifacts gain new clarity. They weren't metaphor. They were biography. Imagine the life she must have led. Trained not just to fight, but to command. Trusted with lives, responsible for victories and retreats alike. Her reputation must have been immense. Not merely allowed to join warriors, but elevated among them. And her burial? It wasn't reluctant acceptance. It was honor. There are no objects in the grave typically associated with female identity. No beads, no domestic tools, no weaving weights. Everything pointed to one role: strategist, leader, warrior. Not in disguise. Not exceptional because of gender, exceptional because of ability. And that changes everything. Because what if her existence was an anomaly, but evidence? Evidence that Viking society, in at least some corners, valued effectiveness over conformity. That a woman who could outthink and outfight her peers could rise, not hidden, not masked, but recognized. The sagas have long whispered of women who fought. Lagertha, the avenging widow, Hervera, who summoned her dead father's sword, Brynhild, cast out by gods for daring to wield power. They were always seen as legends. Until Berka. Now flesh and bone support what story once carried alone. And yet her story still provokes doubt. Skeptics ask, was she truly a warrior, or merely buried like one? Were the weapons hers, or symbolic? Was she a leader, or just someone's daughter? But if those same questions were applied to the male graves of her era, few would stand. We do not require scars to call a man a warrior. We read his weapons as testimony. Why then do we demand more of her? Because her existence challenges the scaffold of assumption that archaeology has leaned on for decades. It forces a rereading of every grave where weapons and gender don't neatly align. It demands that we ask, who else have we misclassified? Who else have we silenced with our certainty? She has no saga written in ink, but in the silence of soil and the elegance of her burial, her society told us exactly who she was. They buried her as a leader. Before she ever lifted a sword or commanded a garrison, she traveled, not by sea, not yet, but through land, through shifting landscapes of childhood and ritual, marked invisibly in her teeth. And even in death, those molars held on to the secret. She didn't begin her life in Berka. She came from somewhere else. Strontium isotope analysis, a method that deciphers geological fingerprints, revealed a subtle, powerful truth. Each molar, first, second, third, forms during different stages of youth. The chemical signatures they absorbed traced her passage through environments, like ink writing her biography inside bone. And the readings didn't match the local Berka baseline. She was not born in the city, where she was buried with such honor. That singular detail unravels another layer of her identity. Because in the Viking world, mobility wasn't chaos, it was structure. Elites moved with purpose. Children of noble blood were sent across regions to be fostered, trained, tested. Merchant families crossed seas. Military envoys rode rivers deep into foreign lands. She wasn't an exception. She was part of a system. Her journey, then, wasn't an accident of war or exile. It was likely a trajectory, planned, sanctioned, even privileged. A childhood shaped by relocation, by integration into networks that spanned the North Atlantic. Her presence in Berka was not a matter of chance. It was destiny sealed by strategy. Berka itself was no ordinary outpost. It was a hive of exchange, where goods from the Byzantine Empire met furs from the north, where silks from Asia brushed shoulders with amber from the Baltic. It was here that culture collided with ambition, and where status was displayed in burial more than in life. For her to end up in its most commanding grave? That wasn't coincidence. The science confirms what the sagas imply, but never prove. That movement in the Viking Age wasn't only male-driven. Women traveled too. Some were taken, others chose. And a few, like her, likely moved as part of elite transactions, woven into political or military arrangements where skill mattered more than conformity. She might have trained in one region, learned dialects in another, and fought in a third. Her adaptability wasn't just cultural, it was strategic. The Viking world didn't reward stillness. It revered the ones who could navigate shifting ground, both literally and socially. Her isotopic signatures echo that truth. They're not outliers, they're markers of integration. She absorbed the world through experience long before she commanded it through warfare. And that layered origin story only deepens the magnitude of her final resting place. In a time where geography shaped fate, she moved across invisible lines and redrew them. So when we look at her burial not just through artifacts, but through the lens of geological memory, a richer portrait emerges. One not just of a woman who fought, but of a woman who crossed boundaries long before battlefields ever called her name. Her legacy isn't static. It traveled, just like she did. She didn't just challenge a social order. She stood at the edge of it, looked it in the eye, and stepped beyond. In a world governed by iron laws of kin, honor, and bloodline, her existence wasn't rebellion. It was precision, a calculated deviation the system couldn't ignore. Viking society was often painted in bold lines. Men raided, women wove. Men led, women waited. But real life rarely obeys such sharp contrasts. And in the silence of grave BJ 581, we see those lines blur, not by mistake, but by design. She was no myth, no disguised daughter hiding in armor. Her burial makes no apology for who she was. There's no pretense in her final display. Every object surrounding her speaks the same language: rank. Not tolerated, not exceptional, acknowledged. But what kind of society does that? One that, while male-dominated, left room at the margins for those who could command loyalty, deliver strategy, and maintain status, regardless of sex. Not because it was progressive by modern standards, but because it was pragmatic. In the Viking world, survival often depended on competence. Lineage mattered. So did alliances, inheritance, and land. But when swords were drawn and lives hung in balance, leadership couldn't afford to be sentimental. And in this rare case, it wasn't. Still, we have to ask, how common was she? The archaeological record offers whispers, not declarations. Graves of women with weapons appear in Norway, Denmark, Sweden. Sometimes it's a spear, sometimes a sword, but rarely with the clarity seen in burqa, the placement, the completeness, the unmistakable message. That's what makes her burial so potent. It's not just that she held power, it's that her community enshrined it. There's no evidence of erasure, no signs that her grave was tampered with, altered, or minimized. Her weapons weren't off to the side. Her horses weren't an afterthought. She was laid to rest as one who had earned her place among the warrior elite. And that demands we reconsider the lens through which we viewed Viking gender roles. Perhaps it wasn't about rigid exclusion. Perhaps it was more fluid, more situational. Maybe power in that era didn't only descend through men. Maybe it also emerged through action, loyalty, and reputation. Maybe her family held sway, or maybe she did alone. Either way, someone decided she was worth remembering. And memory in the Viking age was sacred. To be forgotten was a second death. To be buried with honor was a final chapter written deliberately. She wasn't erased. She was elevated. Her presence cracks open a space that academia long ignored, a space where women weren't just exceptions, but agents. Not anomalies, but contenders. She proved that even within patriarchal systems, skill could rewrite the rules, if only for a moment. So was she the first of her kind? Or the only one we've found so far? That question lingers, unanswered. But this much is certain. Whatever power structure existed in burqa, it made room for her. And that room was carved not through myth, but through merit. Long after her bones turned to dust, she remained, hidden in the blood of strangers, scattered across continents, pulsing quietly through lineages that never knew her name. Her story wasn't just buried in burqa. It survived in chromosomes, echoing across the genetic memory of Europe. She belonged to people who didn't simply conquer by blade. They left their imprint in DNA. And her own genome is a key to that legacy. Ancient as it is, it speaks in a language we're only just beginning to understand. Her mitochondrial lineage, passed from mother to child, was classified as T2b, a branch once spread across ancient Europe, now detectable in modern populations. But the real power of her DNA lies not in ancestry, but in geography. Her genetic profile overlaps with people across southern Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and unexpectedly, the British Isles, Iceland, the Orkneys, even the Baltics. This wasn't random. It was a reflection of how the Viking world operated. Less like a kingdom, more like a web. Trade routes, marriage alliances, seasonal raids, and permanent settlements. Each strand pulled people together from different origins. Genetics didn't unify them, culture did. She was a product of that fusion, a living node in a sprawling network of movement and integration. Her DNA confirms what artifacts alone could not, that Viking identity was never about purity. It was about participation. And she wasn't alone. Large-scale genomic studies of Viking Age remains, like those published in Nature and Cell, show that the Viking label was worn by people of diverse genetic backgrounds. Some had ancestry from the eastern Baltic, others from southern Europe. Many bore the Y chromosome markers of Scandinavia, but mixed them with mitochondrial lines from the British Isles or even the Caucasus. This wasn't an empire of bloodlines. It was an empire of motion. The myths told of longboats filled with bearded warriors. But DNA reveals something far more complex. Family units, multi-ethnic communities, and women, Scandinavian and otherwise, present from the very beginning of Viking expansion. In Iceland, for example, modern studies show a fascinating split. While most Y chromosomes trace back to Norse men, the majority of mitochondrial DNA comes from Gaelic women, brought from Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. These women weren't always wives. Sometimes they were captives, but they became part of the Viking story nonetheless, and traces of that story still live today. In parts of northern Scotland and Orkney, up to 30% of men carry Y haplogroups directly tied to Norse settlers. In Normandy, France, once a Viking duchy, subtle echoes of those same markers persist. Even in Greenland and Newfoundland, genetic hints suggest that Viking exploration reached further than we thought, perhaps even including encounters with indigenous peoples of North America. Her grave was silent for centuries, but now her DNA shouts, not just that she was a warrior, but that she was part of something vast, a movement that didn't just take land, but reshaped gene pools. Her lineage may have ended in Burka, or it may have continued, scattered and renamed. We may never know if she bore children, but we know the world she belonged to, a world that believed in legacy, not just through blood, but through impact. And that impact still lingers in the cells of millions. She chose a path carved not in legend, but in danger. Every step she took toward the battlefield came with a price far heavier than steel. For a woman in the Viking world to live, not merely exist, as a warrior was not just rare, it was dangerous in a way few dared to understand. Her burial speaks of strength, her weapons of skill, her horses of command. But behind all that honor lies a darker truth. The risks she faced were greater than those of any man. Because for her, failure didn't just mean death. It meant what came after. Historical accounts from the very regions Vikings raided, Anglo-Saxon England, Frankish territories, Slavic lands, all speak of what befell captured women. Enslavement, exploitation, public humiliation. For female fighters, there was no protection in surrender, no recognition of rank in defeat. They were stripped not just of dignity, but of personhood. And yet, she still stepped into the arena. Why? Was it loyalty to kin? A hunger for glory? Or something deeper? The quiet refusal to be told who she could be. To bear arms wasn't only a military act. It was political, cultural, defiant. She didn't wear a disguise. She wasn't hiding behind a male name. Her community knew. And still, they buried her with the full honors of a warrior. That tells us something profound. Not just about her, but about them. Her society, at least in this fragment of time and place, made room for her courage. And that courage was likely tested in ways no man around her ever faced. Because to lead meant facing enemies outside the walls, and doubts within her own. How many second guesses did she survive? How many times did she have to prove, again and again, that her command wasn't a novelty, but a necessity? The silence of her skeleton hides those battles, but the absence of female objects in her grave speaks volumes. She wasn't being honored as a daughter, or a wife, or a woman. She was being honored as a warrior. Nothing more, and nothing less. And yet, even in death, she continues to fight, this time, against erasure. Even today, there are voices that try to redefine her. Some insist she was symbolic. Others say the weapons weren't really hers. Some even suggest her body must have been buried beside a man, long lost to time. But the science refuses to bend. The bones belong to one person. The DNA is female. The weapons were placed with precision. The grave tells a singular, unapologetic story. And that's where her power truly lies. Because history has always tried to simplify women like her, to explain them away, to push them into margins. But she refuses the margins. She breaks the frame. She is not legend. She is not metaphor. She is proof. And proof, once uncovered, cannot be buried again.